So welcome everybody to this Skoll World Forum Marmalade Festival event. To get us started, I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl Dorsey, who is on the board of the Skoll Foundation and the president of Echoing Green, a foundation that is near and dear to many of us here who are attending Skoll right now. Cheryl.
Thank you. Thank you, Sasha. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I am so happy to be here. I know day one of Skoll and I'm already losing my voice. This is what this week is about. All the talking and all the bonding, but that's a good sign of the conversations to come. But I appreciate being with you this morning, and I'm so grateful to you, Sasha, for asking me to join and kick off this extraordinary panel. And it means a lot to me because, as Sasha is saying, I'm wearing two hats this morning as president of Echoing Green and as a board member of the Skoll Foundation. And I'm going to do the Wayback Machine. I know both Sasha and Sana's organization because in 2005, we first met Sasha when he was starting RefugePoint, and he became a fellow in 2006 and had the extraordinary journey of so many of the world's top social innovators, then becoming a Draper Richards Kaplan Fellow, a Ashoka Fellow, sort of getting all the acknowledgments that the work he was doing at RefugePoint, his vision for building a new approach to advancing lasting solutions for refugees was the right trajectory. And it's been extraordinary to watch his work and his leadership across the sector. I got to know Sana's predecessor at Asylum Access because the founder of that organization, Emily Arnold Fernandez, became an Echoing Green Fellow the next year in 2007. So the work that you do at Asylum Access is critical to this ecosystem, and just an extraordinary example of how law and policy and advocacy can really change the world. And sort of now taking off my Echoing Green hat and putting on my Skoll board member hat, the Skoll board released an incredible spring letter written by Don Gibson, Marla Blow, the CEO and the COO of Skoll. And they talked about how Skoll is re-envisioning and thinking about the social innovation landscape and the growing importance of systems orchestrators. So organizations and leaders who are not just focusing on their work, but starting to broaden their horizon to change their fields writ large. And this is what this panel of leaders is about. This is what collective action and collective impact looks like, right? So the work that Sue is doing at the Equality Fund, what Nasra is doing through the Aspen Institute and her work as a global development leader, and what Sana and Sasha are doing is the future of social innovation. These problems are big and hairy, and we need audacious solutions. And I think the collective impact approach that you all are taking by coming together is what this work is about. So I just sort of am so thrilled to be inserted ever so briefly to say we applaud you. We think this is what social innovation in the future looks like. And I'm glad you all are here because you need to be part of the solution as well. So I'm looking forward to joining part of the conversation before I have to head back to a Skoll gathering. But thank you for having me and looking forward to hearing more about the conversation. So welcome, and I'm sure it's going to be a great conversation. So over to you, Sasha. And can I just say one last thing? Sorry. I was just thinking, Echoing Green has sort of been in the game for a long time and sort of came at social innovation through the lens of social justice. And we really think about our work through a movement building lens. And another reason I'm so excited about Sasha's leadership and the work that you all are doing is because you're thinking in movement building terms. And sort of the work of the movement in this moment around sort of lasting solutions for refugees is really what movements do best. They shift power and they shift resources to the most proximate voices and those who are closest to the issue. That's where the solutions are. That's where the magic is. And another reason I'm so excited about the work that you all are doing together is because you see that and you're living into that. And that's really important, and we need more of that in this space. And I think you all are leading the way on that. So excited to hear more about sort of this movement building work. So again, excited to hear what you all have to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. I do want to say that something in the DNA of Echoing Green has actually embedded itself, I think, into many organizations that are Echoing Green Fellow organizations. And that is the value of supporting others and looking to make connections and not just thinking of yourself and what your own organization is doing, but how to build and grow a field. And that's certainly something that has really inspired RefugePoint and I think many others that I've seen who've come through the Echoing Green Fellowship. is the importance and necessity of supporting other people, recognizing what they do, who they are, how they operate, and seeing how to make connections. So that is a value that undergirds how we operate. Thank you, Cheryl, for being such a critical and fundamental part of RefugePoint, and thank you for opening this.
Of course.
It is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone. I know some of you just flew in this morning. Ina Brewer, for example, from Need just flew in this morning. Others of you have been here for a few days, so welcome. We're really pleased to have you here for this important discussion. I am thrilled and really honored to have colleagues and friends here with me to talk about how to center the voices and leadership of refugees and people with lived experience in philanthropic and humanitarian action. Sue Snyder with the Equality Fund, the Vice President for Strategy, Innovation, and Impact.
I'm sorry, it's long.
Sana Mustafa, the CEO of Asylum Access, and Nasra Ismail, an Aspen Institute Fellow who's currently also studying leadership at Harvard and is a consultant, are here with me to dive into this really important topic. And I just want to provide a few opening comments and to frame this. We thought we'd approach this from the humanitarian perspective because more and more people are forcibly displaced today. The world just tipped over 100 million people who fled their homes. And among those who are refugees and have crossed an international border, the average amount of time before they return home is somewhere between 10 and 20 years. But there are many people that we know or have come into contact with who are refugees for 30 or 40 or even 50 years. The world needs new solutions to this challenge and problem. Over $30 billion a year. In fact, this year I think the humanitarian appeal was 51 or 52 billion. But over 30 billion a year goes to addressing immediate, urgent needs. If we look back at 2016, the World Humanitarian Summit in Turkey brought together global leaders, governments, and the leaders of the largest NGOs in the world to collectively say, how can we do better? What can we do differently? And one of the key insights was how to localize aid. How to make sure that it gets on the ground to the people who are impacted by the crises that they're addressing and dealing with, and who are the leaders on the ground there. And the goal at that time was to try to get 25% of humanitarian funding within the next 5 years to go directly to local actors. Do you know how much in 2020, after that 5 years, went or was going to local actors? Does anybody have an idea? I see you're smiling. 3%? Anybody else have an idea?
That feels high. That's high.
1 million.
Yeah, 1 to 2%. It was actually like 0.5% according to DevEx. So this is actually not happening. And yet with COVID and in so many other circumstances, we see that the people who are on the ground, who are closest to these issues, whose lives are being impacted by conflicts, are the ones who have the solutions, are the ones who know how to respond, and yet they are cut off from leadership. They are cut off from power. They are cut off from being able to influence the responses. That simply doesn't work anymore. So we need to find out and figure out how to change that. One of the reasons I really love the Skoll World Forum is because this is a place that brings visionaries together to think about the future and to think about actions that can shape and change things for the better. So I'm thrilled here to be joined by these colleagues, and I'd like to start just by asking each of you to share who you are in whatever way you'd like. And maybe, Sana, would you start?
I knew it. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sasha, for having me here, and thank you, Cheryl, for launching us into this conversation. It's really so refreshing and nice to see many familiar faces here. It just means that many of us sticked around for the conversation, and for the supporters who've been with us for years. When I came here in 2018 and 17 to Skoll, I was talking about the same thing, but gladly I feel like we've evolved a bit of, I was talking about like, can we have people, refugees in the room talking about refugees, and now, we start talking about funding to refugees. So maybe that's progress on the movement side, as the global side did not make much progress. To tell you a bit more about myself, I identify as a human rights defender. I'm a feminist. I see myself as a political activist because I see refugee crisis and displacement as a very much political issue at first and foremost. And as someone who was politically raised in Syria under the Assad regime oppression and brought into a family that really resisted the oppression that was imposed on us for decades, and as someone who really, from early on, from like 3-4 years, learned how to navigate existence in the private space, in the family space, where we can have conversations about every and anything, whereas in the public space, as we say in Syria, there is someone watching over every single one of us. And so it really always lived two realities. And that enhanced my awareness and my awareness to not only myself and my existence, but also to the environments I exist in and the injustices that happen around me, and really equipped me to always speak up and be grounded in those values. So when the revolution happened in Syria in 2011, and many of us protested against the Assad regime and the dictatorship, everyone, especially 12 years into it, we just marked the 12-year anniversary in March 15th of this year. I got the same question many times of like, it's been 12 years, like, look at the loss, right? Do you regret it? And my answer is that, first, absolutely not. I would do it over and over and over and over again. And I think the question is not to the people who protested, do we regret it? To the question, do you regret not doing anything about us, about what happened in Syria? Do you regret watching, us being killed and, bombed and used, killed actually by chemical weapons? And it's ongoing and being forcibly displaced, 12 million of us, 6 internally displaced and 6 become refugees. So the question is not to us that we are revolted. It's always the one who refused the abuse, like you get questioned of like, oh, it was quiet, like why did you make a fuss? And if anything, I think the question should be reversed. So I hope that tells you who I am. And so when I came and I became a person who are a refugee right now, because my own father was forcibly disappeared by the Assad regime on July 2nd, 2013, which again marking the 10th year anniversary of his disappearance this year, as we don't know if he's alive or dead. When I came to the US, it was really naively, I thought I just left, an oppressive dictatorship. And I came to the US and I just found another multi-layered systems of oppression that really similarly as, and I say those identities not as political identities, as really existential identities, as a refugee, as a brown woman, as a queer woman, as a Syrian, just found that the system is not designed for any of us to start with, and not designed for even someone who's an activist who wants to shape the future of Syria and my current life as a refugee, that there's actually no entry points to start with, even to how we talk about my narrative, my story, my people's narrative and story, let alone how we shape our lives and policies. And that led me into using what I have in my tools at the time when I had nothing, which is my voice and my values. And these two tools really equipped me so far to be able to speak up and bring others along. And I think it's one thing to point out the problem and to speak up about the issue is another thing that I learned from the revolution in Syria by bringing many Syrians along in this revolution, is that you cannot do it alone and we have to do it in movement. And that's exactly what I've been doing with many other refugees and allies for the last 10 years, is just building this movement that's honestly not about localization. It's about shifting power and resources. It's about equity. It's about recognizing the wrongdoing of the past, of the colonial racist system that we operate in, and how can we undo that in allyship, in partnership, and how can we launch, the future? Because we learn from the feminist movement, from indigenous rights movement, black rights movements don't succeed because allies only did the work and received the money. Movements succeed because they are led by those most affected and those with lived experience.
I want to pause for a sec to say, Sasha, thank you for that. And thank you for sharing something of yourself as well. Sana is the first female CEO of an international human rights organization and someone with lived experience. There are nobody else out there like her. You should be keynoting something bigger at Skoll.
Should be the norm.
Thank you, Sana. Sue, I want to turn it over to you to just share with us who you are and how you come to what you do today.
Great, thanks. If you could just insert my picture over my colleague Kat's. I'm sorry, she was supposed to be here but had an emergency at home. So I think the Equality Fund's a bit nervous because Kat's a little bit more circumspect in how she communicates, and I tend to be a little bit more transparent. So thank you, Sasha, for having me here. I think my story is centers around two questions. I think when I started my career, I'm Canadian, I started my career and asked myself, how can I be successful in this world? And, I've had the privilege of working in not-for-profit organizations and working in private sector organizations, working as a consultant, working as a lawyer. And about 5 years ago, I realized that maybe I'm asking the wrong question. The question, how can I be successful in my values, in my career, as a mother, as a partner? And what I realized is that, I'm not sure the world as it is the type of world that I want to be successful in. Is this the type of world that I want to be successful in? Or can I be a part of a world that is a bit different? And I started a process of unlearning a lot of the behaviors and patterns and biases and leadership competencies that, as someone who's white, as someone who's privileged, as someone who has 3 university degrees, as someone who is lived inside of private sector and some civil society organizations, it's a pattern of thinking and leading that that worked for me individually. I was designed to be very successful in this world as it's currently unfolding, because I was born into a lot of privilege. But what I realized is that I needed to be a part of designing a world that allows success to happen in different ways. And so then my journey, Sasha, is moving out of the very comfortable, privileged world that I lived in and moving into the Equality Fund. At the time, about 4 years ago, we were a 13-person organization with a budget of about $1 million. And 4 years later, we're a 65-person organization. And this year, we just moved $20 million in grants to people around the world. So I couldn't be happier. Yeah, it's an amazing place to be.
Thank you, Sue. And I want to dive in more to what each of you do and how you do it. But let's move now to Nasra, whom I met some time ago and just was enchanted with how you think and how you see the world. And so I'd love for you to share who
Thank you,
are.
Sasha. I appreciate it. Likewise. I've become a friend and a mentor, so I really appreciate our time together, and getting to know you in the pandemic was really, really wonderful. I'm Nasra Ismail. I am really sad that I'm following 2 fantastic folks, and of course our keynote, Cheryl. My name means the someone who facilitates success for other people, the assistance, the giver. And I think when I was bugging my mom when I was very young, we were raised and born in Somaliland, which is the northern part of Somalia. And we came to the US as refugees. And so when I used to bug my mom about why did you have 10 kids? But I am her 10th, and why she called me that? I get a really beautiful story, and it's one that really affirms who I am. And it really has been perhaps the greatest marker of success for me in terms of living up to what my parents wanted me to live up to, which is the kind of person who facilitates success for other people. I say that after 17 years of doing international development work, first 7 years with the US government, got lost in consulting for 2 years, went abroad and went back to my home country, which is where my family fled from in the early 90s, and served in a professional capacity. That was probably the most remarkable experience I ever had. It's very much like what Sana is talking about in terms of both having a personal debacle with the country that basically you fled from, but then now you're going back as a humanitarian. so it does a number on your identity. But it is perhaps the most incredible work I've done to date. And then more recently, since the pandemic, I've moved back to the US and I've been in philanthropy and I've been in consulting. I look very young, so it doesn't look like I've been working for maybe 20 years. So I know that's shocking, but I like to think perhaps my name has something to do with my youthfulness. Who I am is really both how I exist in my family, but it's also who I am in terms of my professional career. I have probably the longest survivor's guilt of people like me. You know, we don't get to think about what would it be really like to live a life where we're not necessarily giving back? What would it look like if I never left home? What would it look like if I never lost my father? What would it look like if I actually chose something out of deep passion and not necessarily a survivor's guilt? I'm very happy with what I'm doing. I've dedicated my life to service. But at the same time, I recognize that the work that I'm doing is deeply felt because of experiences I had when I was a very young child. And so that's something I'm proud of, but every now and then I really do play with the if factor and say, what if I was a basket weaver? What if I actually did continue playing basketball? I started playing basketball in Oakland, California, and I was pretty good. I was very, very good. My highest points in a junior high school game was 35. Wow. And for 5'4" and growing, but I was 5'2" then, and I could box like no one's business. And I had a shooter. I had a name for the shot that I would take, and I was always called the girl with the hijab who could do a sweet shot from several feet behind the third point line. So I'm a lot of things, but really, mainly I'm what my mom and my parents called me, which is somebody who facilitates other success. It's how I came into localization before 2020. It's how I came into working with donors, with UN, with agencies that are both local and international to facilitate that collectively we really can get to solving some of the biggest problems that are ailing our world. And power is at the heart of it. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Nasra. Wow. Thanks for sharing all that. I didn't know about the basketball.
I'm with you on the basketball court, Nasra.
Let's go.
We need some tall people.
We're filling in big roles.
Good, so we're a team. I think as a team, the next thing that I'd like to do is try to sketch out the problem, like what you have seen the problem to be. And Nasra, maybe we'll continue and start with you. When you were in Somalia, you were building local networks of leaders there.
Yeah.
But you faced a lot of challenges there. Could you start to try to sketch out some of the challenges you saw and you faced? And Sue, please jump in. And Sana, please jump in if you want to add some points.
Sure. I went to school. All of my schooling have been in the U.S., but my identity really is rooted at home, and that's my first home. So when I left Washington, D.C., after about 7-8 years of kind of really feeling very comfortable working in a donor environment, working in the U.S. government system, procurement, foreign assistance, State Department, I can go on, but let's not. I went abroad, and I really went abroad for two reasons, and one was to reconnect with my homeland, and the second was to challenge myself and to sort of follow what most of my colleagues called we're going to the field. And so I found myself having a lot of international development experience, but going into an arena that I really wasn't prepared for, at least from my experience in Washington, D.C. I became very, very quickly someone who was recognized by the international system as a bridge builder, a network weaver, somebody who can help translate these awful project management tools, these strategies, these formulas for policymaking into something that can actually have impact. So I became the head of the first Somali woman who was the head of a program at Oxfam International after 35 years of that program existing in Somalia. No one thought, we should have someone who is from that community to be the head. I followed that up by working and going from Nairobi to Mogadishu and becoming the second time, the first Somali woman to head a network of 100 NGOs, a coalition called Somali NGO Forum, which is under CARE International. So I became first for many different things, but for me, what I encountered and the challenges that have now been a big part of who I am and a big part of the problems that I see is ultimately it's inequity. ultimately we have great formulas for poverty reduction, for getting humanitarian assistance to the people that we care about most. But we do it in a way which seems like it is the most scenic route. It is a route that is far from impact. It is a route that really centers everybody but the community. And so Oxfam, some of these other organizations, they really are the same. I'm not pointing one out of many, but I can say it is the most inefficient system I have seen in terms of the protocol of getting people the things that they need most in the best way, in the most efficient way. And so the challenges that I saw had a lot to do with internal management of structures and power dynamics that constantly became the biggest barriers to impact, the biggest barriers to the things that we said funding is needed to get this so that we don't see children dying. And so I continue to battle that challenge, and I'm sure you guys can add a lot more to it.
Yeah, I'll jump on that, Santa, maybe. I'm gonna have to get some water. I'm losing my voice too before the World Forum even starts. So hot pursuit on that. The Equality Fund is one of over 40, I think now, women's funds in the world. And the women's funds movement started, thank you, Sasha, started to emerge about 20 years ago when women realized that there was lots and lots of money moving in the system for gender equality. None of it moving into the hands of women. All of it moving into pre-existing systems that reinforced the gender inequalities that women were living with. So this is the parallel movement as Santa is experiencing what life is like in the field. Good Lord, the language that we use. The feminist movements are building their own pipeline of resources to move money to each other. And inside of a women's fund, you will never hear women referred to as beneficiaries. It's kind of like, this is where I shouldn't be speaking in public, but nobody's gonna Twitter this, I hope. It's kind of like being married and your husband is the income earner and gives you an allowance. That's what it feels like to be a beneficiary. It doesn't matter if you co-design. It doesn't matter if you were doing this in service of women. You need to put the money and the power and the agency in the hands of women on the front lines who can make change happen for themselves on their own terms in their own local contexts. So I think as the international development system was increasingly gathering around gender equality, which everybody appreciated, the women's and the feminist movements were stepping in to say, okay, this is fantastic that money is now moving to gender equality, but if women do not have the power and agency over the money, then systems are not going to change. So I think that is part of the landscape that we're in right now, and part of how we're trying to change the way that money moves into the hands of women in a local context in ways that I think are really liberating as opposed to constraining.
Sana, I want to come to you, but Sue, I just want to highlight that I think one of the exciting things about what the Equality Fund is doing is that you are connected with government and leadership, but you're transforming how government money should be from a $300 million grant from the Canadian government to seed and start the Equality Fund.
Yeah, so we were the Match International Women's Fund, and had decided not to take government money to support because it was very constrained to only supporting women in very certain ways, which I won't get into. There was a change of government in Canada, and then magically we ended up with a prime minister who decided he was feminist, which was a bit of a shock to all of the feminists, but that's great. So then feminists start dreaming and scheming, right? Well, if we have a prime minister that's self-identified as a feminist, put your money where your mouth is. And so we worked it up to 300 million. And so we're now, what we try to do is to weave different types of money together, is to weave government money, philanthropic money, investment capital in ways that ensure that we are having a gender equality impact for every kind of dollar that moves through and around the Equality Fund and eventually always into the hands of women and allies.
Thank you, and I was jumping ahead of myself, but it's because I really love what the Equality Fund does, what it stands for, and what it's doing in the world. But I want to continue to just sketch the landscape out. Sana, I know as you were listening to colleagues here, you had probably a lot of thoughts about what the challenges were. You shared some of that personally from coming to the US and feeling very excluded from the system here. Can you share a little more about the challenges you've seen, maybe both in the US and personally, but also more broadly, and then we'll get into how you're addressing those.
I mean, it's very much what both my colleagues talked about here. It's really not necessarily in the what, it's really in the how and the who. You know, there's no shortages, as Nasra said, of solutions and bold solutions. And it's really, I'm not sure what's anything would be more innovative that never been talked about in the past. Like, we've created a fund for refugees by refugees. It's like innovative. The first but is like nothing innovative about it. It's like in many ways it's like what we've learned from other movements. You know, like we looked at the Equality Fund when we were designing our fund. We looked at other funds. So what's innovative about it is that it's the who. It was like a fund by refugees for refugees, and also the how is that it's really about equity at the center. What does inclusive, equitable, participatory grant making looks like? What shifting power looks like? So really, I think the formula I always talk about for the sector to think about is like, can we stop being fixated on the what? Like this organization is helping 1 million people, so it must be like, this is the one. And I'm like, can we ask about how and who, by who and for who? And also how? Is that centering equity at the heart of it? Is that actually shifting power? Is that long term? Because this being fixated on like this big numbers, and again, I think it's very important maybe to even understand the underlying ground for all the what that we think about, like what's actually the mindset that's moving, the philosophy that's looking at the what in our sector. And we find that this philosophy, the mindset that's looking at the what and understanding the what and promoting the what in the sector is a ground that's really, really rooted in oppressive systems. It's grounds that are rooted in sexism, and racism, and colonialism. And I'm not talking about here just like throwing words, like seriously, if you look at where the money comes from to whom, it's all global north to global south, the language, beneficiaries, the way we work, it's white dominant professional culture, how we conduct meetings, who writes English well to apply for an application, who can even qualify to apply for an application, who has a legal status to exist even to apply for an application, to get registered as a group or to get a bank account. So the system is really feeding itself. And that cycle is not coming out of nowhere. And I think in building a movement, we cannot really build a sustainable long-term movement without acknowledgement of the roots of where we're coming, without also accountability to the past and ongoing wrongdoings and reconciliation. And I think one of the major issues that, again, every time I talk about this, like, but practically, what can we do? And is this practical? And I'm like, I don't know, the sector that never ever tried to sit down and have a really brave, important conversation about, man, me being with you in the room is traumatizing. Is triggering. Being with UNHCR in meetings, I promise you, not only my experience, is constantly triggering. It's constantly traumatizing. So yes, we cannot just celebrate all the time. And you asked me to applaud for you for creating an advisory board as participation and meaningful inclusion, while you haven't done the unlearning, you haven't looked internally on your institutional structures that literally prevent any of us to really be part of it, let alone receiving funding. So this is really, my message here is that the how and the who matters, and the ground of it matters. So yes, it's gonna start with the personal unlearning and examination, because that's what's gonna go into the institution, and that's what's gonna go into the ecosystem.
Can I add one thing? So I can recognize either you all are getting exactly what we're saying, or there might be a little bit of a disconnect, because there are particular systems which it is very difficult to form feelings and opinions around unless you've lived it. My career looks very different. My activism looks different because I know the UNHCR meeting. I've lived it 100 times. So let me just tell you what that meeting looks like. I'm in Somalia. I'm the head of this 100 NGOs. 80% of them are international. The biggest you can think of every big brand name you can think of an international NGO. The rest are the local civil society who facilitate the success of the international NGOs. We meet with the head of the UN, we meet with the head of the collective donors, we meet with the heads of federal as well as sub-national governments. The discussions are what you would imagine any management team, leadership team, executive team to be. What are the needs, where are we going to fund, what decisions we have to make, and what are the barriers that we have to tackle. My first year, I didn't see a single local voice. I didn't see a single voice from a small organization, be it international or local. I didn't see young people at the table. I mean, we were having conversations about people and making decisions for them without them even knowing where the meeting was. I don't know what that feels like if, let's say you have all the power dynamics we're gonna talk about hopefully later, but I can tell you the feedback. Local actors, civil society, women's organizations, they don't wanna be there because you send a very powerful signal. You're not needed, not now at least. We'll let you know once we have reality boxes to be moved and local trust building with the clan leaders to be opened. We'll call you when we need you, but we don't need you at the table. So the feedback was we're not respected, we're not needed, except when there's a contract to be signed, except when all the money has come into the country and we have to spend it because otherwise the other money that's gonna come won't have a place to actually live in. So I think if you're looking at the opposites of what it feels like to belong, every local actor I've talked to in the last 6-7 years, particularly in those jobs, has always said, we feel left out, we don't want to be there because we're not wanted, you actually don't care about our people, you care about your systems, and we're a last thought. So I don't know, at some point you have to talk to each other and we all have to say, how do you bring those people back? It's more than DEI statements. It's more than 1 or 2 token folks at the board level. It takes the same trust one has to build if you were in a marriage and you did kind of ignore your partner, not for 2 days, for 3 days, but for 35 years. How do you bring trust back of a partner who you need if you've ignored them for decades? It's gonna take a long time.
I'll just add one personal anecdote too. Very early on when I was working with the International Organization for Migration in Kenya, and there was a decision to be made at the US government level, and it was whether or not to resettle a group called the Sudanese Lost Boys and Girls first, or the Somali Bantus first. Both were refugee groups in Kenya. The Somali Bantus were in Dadaab camp. The Sudanese Lost Boys and Girls were in Kakuma camp. And the discussion was with the leaders at UNHCR, IOM, the State Department, and other organizations that were involved in resettlement. And I was a fly on the wall there very early on. This was like in 1999. And what struck me about the decision that was being made then about people's lives, thousands of people's lives, and who would have access to this solution and who would have to wait for another few years with all the extraordinary hardships that result from that in these places. There was not one person, as you can imagine, from the Somali Bantu community or from the South Sudanese community who was at that table saying, this is some of our perspective here. Nothing. And it was just such a slap in the face around who's making decisions and how decisions are made, and that nobody from the impacted people are at this table. So I want to move now. This is just incredible, by the way, and I didn't want to interrupt, Nasra, your comments after Sana, but Sana, I did want to say to yours, Sana is a fantastic thought leader who's been writing a lot about these issues. Her recent article, how it's titled how the UN Refugee Convention is racist and colonial, is an incredibly powerful article that is being shared around, and we can share it with you as well, but she's writing other articles as well, and her thought leadership is emerging and I hope continues to influence many organizations in this space. And she also referenced a fund of refugees to refugees. That was the iconic Impact Award, which is a $12 million award that there's a global call, and Sana's organization, Asylum Access, won that award in collaboration with refugee leaders from around the world to create the first ever fund built for refugees by refugees funding refugees, a participatory fund. So it's really extraordinary. Okay, we're moving into what are some of the steps we can take, what are some of the solutions, but I will again just highlight back to what we said at the beginning, billions and billions of dollars, right, go to humanitarian response, and yet I think we are at like this crucible moment in history where there are more and more people displaced, there's a recognition that we have to change and do things differently, and yet the change is not necessarily coming from the top. It's not coming from those who hold traditional power. What we're seeing, it's coming from other places. So how do we start to change things? What are you doing to change things, and what can we learn from that? Would one of you like to start?
There's so much. I'll say one thing because I think we can all speak to a lot of different elements of this. I think there's the way that we move money, but I think for this particular group in this room, I think what's most important to think about is how we think about power, because we often talk about shifting power, but really, power is held by our colleagues around the world who understand how to change things. We have some money, but I think we need to step out of the mindset of power and start thinking very, very differently about where does power, or where should power really be centered. And there's a colleague in this room who may or may not want to be called out. He's the co-CEO of an organization based out of Sierra Leone and called We Are Purposeful. And the Equality Fund is in a position in Canada to move money. And that is an organization that holds an incredible amount of power, expertise. It's an incredible organization that works with young feminists. These are the future leaders in this country, in this continent. That is power. Having the expertise, the infrastructure, the wisdom to really build up young women. Power is not me sitting in Ottawa, Canada, holding on to money. What I need to do is take myself out of the power dynamic and move money to where it needs to go, to people who hold power that we can amplify. So I think part of feminist funding and part of the funding ecosystem that Sana and I are in particular really thinks about, like, how do we move money in ways that break the systems that have been part of the problem in how power and money moves, I think, in this world. So we can talk a lot about how we do that from a technical perspective, and it's hard moving money, quite frankly, right now to some parts of the world. But I would like to encourage everybody in this room to really investigate how you think about power and where you think power really sits. Because in our world, power sits with Sana's colleagues who are refugees around the world. Power sits with the Syrian women who the Equality Fund moves money to, who are displaced in Lebanon, and the Palestinian women and the Colombian women. Our granting portfolio is multifaceted around gender equality. It's gender equality at the intersections of a lot of this work. But we cross over together, and the funding modality is to lift up these incredible organizations and leaders around the world that are doing amazing things, and to get out of the way, and to try to work with other philanthropists to break out of the thematic funding boxes that require them only to move money in these very narrow boxes that nobody really lives in. So I'll start there, maybe, and pass it on to my colleagues.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I think it's one thing that we're talking about power a lot, and like people, it's a right, it's a basic human rights to have right, a saying in your life, and but not only in the humanitarian field. Like here we're talking about philanthropy, which I think is really it's like a sector where we're taught to be like on the receiving end of it versus like an active even participants in it. And that's another, like, it's one thing to think about the policy sector and humanitarian field and like the right for participation in that and shaping it. It's another thing to be in like, even in philanthropy. It's like, oh, but like that's like where the donor, like that's even above the policymakers, right? It's like in the humanitarian, like that's where like the money resides and like the power resides, and that's where it's really unquestioned of like what you want to tell like someone how to give money or like where to give it and all of that. And I'm like, and that's exactly what we want, yes. Because where the money comes from to start with, we all like it's it's power. I mean, it's again like where the money, it's still the majority of the money in the world lives in certain circles, which again, the same circles that comes from the systems we talked about. And so yes, it is, and I love there was a recent article with the Urgent Action Fund about really it's not about giving, it's about sharing. Because yes, it's redistribution of wealth and power, and yeah, it's the right way to do it. And there are many philanthropists, like McKinsey Scott is one of them, that's talking about unrestricted funding. And again, that could even get better, but and there are other, we have OSF, Porticus, Lemonade, I could like endless numbers of organizations that have come around into like more unrestricted, more direct resourcing for people on the ground, people with the lived experiences. But I think at the heart of it is that there's lots of assumptions of risk, right? The moment we think about Syria, Somalia, Colombia, a donor will immediately go into, fraud, corruption, that's the associations that comes with local actors. I mean, with people from the global majority, whether you're funding them or not. If you think about any group of people, institutions in the global majority, in the global south, north, it's thought about as like immediately there's like question marks around legitimacy, around impact, and around capacity, and around risk. And I think, again, if we dive into, and I'm gonna come back to it, the ground of even like, I asked a donor recently, like, can you tell me what risk there is with funding INGOs? Like, never asked this question. I was like, what risk do you see by funding INGOs? And they said the risk they see is is related to representation. But like before there was no risk, but now because of the movement and like now it looks bad, so there's risk about representation. And I said, okay, so what's the risk you see with funding local actors and refugee-led organizations? And they went into a list of impact and corruption and capacity. And really, I said, well, in our movement, in the feminist movement, across movements, we've been moving money legally, in a legitimate way, liably, from the US and other places, from Canada, from countries where their rules we're following, to people on the ground, millions of dollars, not enough of course, but millions of dollars, and they have been reaching other millions of people and really leading impact, and somehow it's working. And so there is, I think, again, like people say it's not practical. Actually, it is very practical. We're doing it, and there are ways to do it. It's just the perception. It would come back into perception, and that's like why the mindset shifting we do in advocacy and bringing others along and really unpacking. Like, listen, we've done this. Apparently, just one example to show you when there's will, there is power. Suddenly, there's visa processes and legal statuses for Ukrainian refugees. Rightly so, to seek asylum and protection in Europe, in Canada, and the US at the Mexican-US border where no one else is allowed to enter. In 3 months, when we have been, 70 years putting excuses for not giving people legal protection and right for asylum and legal status to exist. And so, is it a risk? It's racism at the core of it. It's really mindset and perception.
Yeah. Nasra, I want to come to you, but I also just want to say when I hear that, the concerns around legitimacy and what's the risk of funding local organizations in places that I don't know, and is there corruption? One of the questions that I would ask is, you don't think there's corruption in other systems? Because there's a massive amount. And Sue, just around the Equality Fund too, I want to get back, just put a pin in this, to how you get money out the door, because I remember speaking to Jessica Hussein, one of the founders of the Equality Fund, and the way she was describing it, like, people can give us whatever they want. in terms of funding proposals, it felt like it was very unstructured. It was very centered around people's own perspective and what they can do. But Nasra, I know you have a lot of thoughts to share listening to colleagues here, so go ahead.
I'm feeling really optimistic. I don't know about you guys. No, I believe in the worldview that Sana is both questioning, but also the one that's underneath it, which is what you're building. And so Sana, I'm signed on to yours. And I think my frame of mind has been that I ignore the questions about legitimacy and risk and corruption because I've worked in the INGOs. So I have insider knowledge. And it's actually one of the things we have in common among all nonprofit civil society is things don't always happen according to plan. It's a very human problem. But it's not, locals are not corruptions and internationals are not, the glorious saviors of the world. I think we just have to demystify that and just maybe put a pin on it. At the same time, the quality of money and the quality of giving is what Sue has talked about. And I think that is, we need 10 times that mindset and that passion and those kind of structures around giving and donorship and what it means to be a partner, a financing one especially. I am, consider myself a very optimistic person. After nearly 2 decades, I am at a point where I think we have an inspiration problem, and I think we have a collective connecting problem. I'm studying leadership because I really do believe the right leadership will get us out of this rut that we find ourselves in. It's a very healthy rut. We are reimagining what it means to be a nonprofit, what it means to be local, regional, international civil society, but it means to band together when all of our tools that have brought us out of the darkness of the 60s, the darkness of the 30s, the darkness of everything that every community has been through. We've had a collective action. We've had people come together. We've had allyships. We've had systems be completely broken down so that new ones can come to fruition. So we have the knowledge, we have the history, but what we need is we need a new way of coming together. And so I believe in coalitions. I'm learning a lot about organizing at the Harvard Kennedy School by a professor who really has come together and changed social change and movements, whether it was Marshall Gantz's support to the Obama grassroots campaigns that have erupted a new kind of political power of inviting young people to the table, or it's the kinds of examples that I'm now looking at in a new way, without centering money or without centering resources. The Montgomery boycott is a great example of how people said, we're willing to use the resources that we have to get the change that we want. And it had nothing to do with money being raised. It had something to do with people saying, I recognize the 2 feet that I walk on, and I'm going to walk to work. And that helped to disassemble a kind of bad power that was happening in that period. And so I'm more than anything convinced that we just have to really work together. We have to stop dividing ourselves into INGOs and local NGOs and global north and global south. Those are real political identities. I don't mean to say they're not important, but we have to figure out what connects us. And what connects us is great stories, great leadership, and 1001 Sanas and 2001, Susan's funding parameter. But we can do it. We really can do it. But it's a thing where I really hope, and I say this without making a joke of it, but anybody who has been in power for the last 30, 40 years and has existed in a kind of status quo, you're gonna want to show up in a different way. You might have to go to therapy. I mean that in the best way, but because it is really difficult to relive in this society in a new way where you are not necessarily on the top, where you are not necessarily a CEO for the next 15, 14 years. I worked with a lot of white CEOs. There's a great fear in them. And I don't do their work for them, but I can tell you, in order for people like me and people like Sana to come into our rightful roles, to come into an era where we have more problems to solve than we have time to rest, we're gonna need those who have been in power to pause, to go to therapy, to deal with everything that comes in decentering, so that folks who need to be centered can take the rightful role. It takes the decentering of the old system and the old power and the centering of the new voices. It takes both, because the most dangerous people I've ever seen, particularly when I joined philanthropy, is very scared white people. And white people who are CEOs There's nothing wrong with them. I don't think I've met a white CEO who is racist, but I've met really scary ones, and they're really dangerous. They're dangerous to people like me who are going to come into the sector. They're dangerous because they don't know, they haven't lived a life where they've followed someone like me, where they've been inspired to take a different role. So I'm really hoping that honestly we have well-being at the center of everything, including people whose power needs to be reimagined. I talk to all of them, I work with them. It's not about being an ally and a bad ally and a good ally. It's about saying, can you come into the conversation in a new way so that we can come into the table in a new way.
That's right.
And I mean to pick on white people, by the
No,
way.
you
It's just
captured
the numbers.
You
That's okay.
captured my growing smile because Nasra, as a RefugePoint board member, I'm like, yes, bring all this to the board. Okay, before we turn it over to you, I feel like we're getting into some very concrete lessons and opportunities here. And I just want to do kind of popcorn style when you talk about mental health and therapy, and you talk about getting money out the door quickly and how to do that. I'd love to just hear some tactics, some concrete things that you think funders or organizations can do so we can start making a list, and then I'd like to turn it over to you to ask questions or to comment and engage with us here. But let's just go kind of popcorn style. If there's any concrete things you're like, this is one, this is another, what are those things?
Yeah, I think one important modality inside of our organization is that if we locate an organization in the world that is doing incredible things, we do not do a due diligence process on their financial capacity to make a decision on whether to fund them. We decide to fund them, and then we say to them, let's figure out what you need to be your best, most successful self, and how can we be an ally to you on that. So I think that is really critical, not to choose not to fund an organization because of perceived financial capacity. You know, we move money, we move our own money in our grant portfolio, and then we move what we call OPM, other people's money, you know, that they don't have access, you know, into the networks that we have. And so we take on these conversations with our donors, right? And I had a donor that was annoyed that one of our grantee partners, when we chose to move money to them, didn't have 2 financial signatories on the bank account. This is the only women's shelter in this community. And you want us not to move money to them because they don't have 2 separate signing authorities on their bank account? We can solve for that together. That's not a reason not to move money. So I think you have to flip the risk profile of not funding an organization based on perceived risk, because the risk is that if you don't fund them, that the world is not going to change. So I think that's a really important practical change.
Yeah.
I fully agree. We do exactly the same. And I just want to say about the risk is that I think one thing about feeling scared when you're so far away about moving money to an organization that's far away on the other side is that because you're far away. And I think that's why having people from the communities making decisions with you is very helpful, because you my partner Basma and Zaytuna in Lebanon, Yarid in Uganda, all of them they make decisions on the fund we give as I do, and they live with these organizations and communities that we're funding as well. And so they know them personally. So I'm not even myself as a refugee making decision from New York, an organization in Lebanon alone and having the trust issues, because actually I know that my colleagues with me also looking at those organizations, working with those organizations, know those organizations, and they know their work as well. So that's why also having the proximity in making decision is important, because it does mitigate the risk as a first step before you dismantle the perceptions where it comes from. I think one thing about also technically...
Sorry, can I just put another point on that, which is that you have the partnerships with those local organizations. You've established the partnerships, you've established the trust. So, and they're the ones identifying others. So it's refugee organizations on the ground in Uganda, in Lebanon, and other countries that you trust, and they're identifying partners to fund.
Yeah,
so
it's
the
an open call. Everyone could come forward. It's not by nomination. But when we make decisions about if we're doubting an organization impact or ability to receive, and then do they exist? Are they legitimate? We don't have that question very much because everyone knows everyone in the community, and we have those people with us making those decisions. Just one thing I want to say about funding, what's helpful as well, I've seen it is just also investing in the individuals as well. I think being married to people who have to exist in an organization, in a group, in an institution, to be able to worthwhile of funding, I think this is really something that we need to work around, because I see many individual leaders working, on their own, mobilizing so many communities, working with others, but not necessarily with an institution. Like, I'm someone who, just 3 years ago, I joined an institution. I worked for 6 years alone because I didn't feel like there's an institution, there's values alignment as much to join at the time. And many times I wouldn't receive support or funding because I don't work with a 501c3 and I don't work with an organization. And I think that element is very important, and also another element of when we support institutions and an organization, to support the individuals as well. I think that's an example of the Elevate Prize model, is that not only supporting the organization itself, but also supporting the individual well-being. And I have to say, I'm a recent recipient of the Elevate Prize of this year, and I was just stunned. I called them multiple times. It's are you sure? Is this really for my well-being? What? And I think that's in itself, I was oh my God, therapy for me and for my family. Exactly, those are the privileges that we don't have access to otherwise. So also centering really resources for the individual's well-being is something very much missing in philanthropy right now.
Nasra, tactics, but congratulations on the Elevate Prize. You have colleagues here from the Elevate Prize, and also on the Mackenzie Scott grant to asylum access.
And to you too.
I think if you're a philanthropist, if you're a donor, if you're a partner, and you want to make an impact, it's not going to be with your money. It's going to be with who you are. It's going to be the kind of leader and the kind of partner that you are. People don't remember the money we spent 5 years ago. We remember the people who were really kind to us. Somebody who dragged us to a panel, Sasha. Sana, who I met virtually, and I was stunned by your experiences and who you are. We really, we center money like it's everything, but we remember connections. I have a friend of mine who's here. If you find Wawira, I'm not going to mess her last name because I love her so much, but Wawira is a young East African philanthropist and a social entrepreneur. She has an organization that's trying to feed 1 million African kids in the next few years. Her organization is called Food for Education. When I was in a donor capacity a couple years ago, I was responsible for due diligence in terms of who she was. She's gotten every big donor philanthropist's money. Getting money was not a problem. But I asked her, I said, who has impacted you? Because we know you're going to scale. I know you are going to be the kind of leader that shapes Africa, nutrition, food security. That is not even a question. She mentioned 4 of the biggest things, and I said, but which one has had an impact on you? Which one do you call when you're in trouble? Which one do you call for inspiration? There's a small organization in San Francisco led by a doctor called the Malago Foundation. She was a fellow for 1 year. She was able to basically write her concept note in that fellowship. She was able to prove her scalability and her formula to scaling to 1 million kids in that fellowship. It's a $100,000 fellowship. She's gotten millions and millions of dollars from other philanthropists, and I think she loves them, and we're not downing them. But impact, the thing that you want to walk away, if you're a philanthropist, is you want people to experience you differently than just you being an ATM.
Yeah, great. I would love to turn it over. Let's just pause on that too. I love those points.
I love it.